What direction do we cut with a bull gouge? Hi, I'm Kent, and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. I remember distinctly when I was trying to figure out the direction of the bull gouge cuts when I was first learning, and it was incredibly frustrating. And no one seemed to be able to explain it. People that understood it, they got it, but they didn't try to explain it very well. And I think a couple of the problems were, or one of the main problem was, is they were trying to look for a quick term to use to just throw out there and make everybody understand what the right direction is. And there's two of them. The first one is cut with the grain. Well, most of the bowls I turn are side grain mounted. That means the grain runs across perpendicular to the headstock and perpendicular to the bed. So when this lathe's turned on, that grain is basically just spinning. So that makes no sense. There's no grain going there, and the grain's spinning. I can't keep up with the grain spinning. So what direction am I cutting? It doesn't make any sense. The other term that's used a lot is just cut downhill. That's all you got to do, just cut downhill. All right, so if I'm standing in front of the bull blank right here and I want to make a curve for the bull bottom, that's downhill. Oh, but wait, if I'm over here and I'm looking at the base of the bowl and the rim's up here, then I'm cutting downhill this way. Both of those terms are very confusing and misleading, and I would like you to try your best to just remove them from your vocabulary. Let's never say cut with the grain and just cut downhill, because it doesn't describe what's really going on. Instead, we need to use a new term, and I would encourage you to share this with everyone else, is we want to make grain supported cuts. Now, using the term grain supported cuts doesn't create a visual in your mind like going downhill or going with the grain, but it is the correct term. When we use a supported grain cut, we're going to get good, clean cuts every time with the bull gouge. And I'm going to explain that to you today in great detail, so stay with me. Now, as tricky as those two terms are, cutting downhill and cutting with the grain, I've got a trick question for you at the end of this video, so stay tuned, and I want to see if you have paid attention to the video and if you can answer the question I'll have for you at the end. Until then, do me a favor, click that like button and subscribe if you're not already subscribing. Click the bell, and you'll be notified when new videos come out. All right, so let's take a look at this for a second up close. Another thing that's important to note is there are a couple cuts we can make on a standard side grain bowl blank that really aren't supported grain dependent or supported grain direction cut dependent. And let me show you those up close and in detail, and I'll make the cuts for you. When we're turning a blank like this, essentially the end grain is what we're most concerned with. The way that we cut through this end grain is what's important. And when we're making an end cut here just to square up the end of a bull blank, because we're going 90 degrees perpendicular through those end grain, the direction of which we cut doesn't matter a tremendous amount. So if I were to come in here and make a cut from left to right, I can do that. I can also come in here and make a cut from right to left. Either one of those cuts is going to do just fine when we're perpendicular to the end grain. Now keep in mind, this is no different than any other wood that we use for a wood project. If there's nothing on the end of this wood and I cut through it, there's going to be torn out end grain fibers, and that's what we're trying to prevent. So let me show you what's going to happen there. If I were to make this pass all the way across, right there you're going to see what happens when you have unsupported grain. There was nothing on the outside of this bowl blank supporting these end fibers, so they were ripped and torn off on both sides of the bowl blank. You can see them right here, they were torn. That's what we're trying to prevent, okay? So one way to get around that is to make a cut that goes across. And instead of going through, make a cut from the other side coming in and that'll help keep those end grains from being torn out on the end of the bulb length. So when we make a face cut, when we come across the face, the same thing is true. So if you think about the layers of wood in a side grain bulb length, that's what this is, a side grain bulb length. Most bulbs are turned side grain. There are end grain bulb lengths, and you can turn a bulb end grain. And I'll show you an example of what the conditions that we're talking about, how that pertains to the end grain bulb lengths. But for the most part, most of our bulb lengths are side grained. That means the grain is actually running sideways through this blank. So if you think of the layers of grain just stacked up, a face cut is essentially just removing the top layer. So it's not as dramatic as making a curved cut that we're going to do in just a moment. But with a face cut like this, we can essentially go through and start from the outside. And go inward, and then we've got a decent clean cut there. We could also, and this pertains to the base of a bowl. Sometimes we get into the bottom of a bowl. We can make a cut from the center and work our way out. Either of those cuts are fine, and they'll make a good passive here that doesn't rip out in-grain fibers, because again, we're just kind of peeling away the top layer of this face. Now, let's talk about what happens when we go through the grain at an angle like we do with the curves of the side of a bowl. So my aha moment was when I was talking with a couple people and they explained to me, well, cutting with the grain is kind of like if you move a knife over a broom, or if you go across your fingers. And they held up their fingers and they showed if you have the bull gouge going this way, it's grain supported. But if you go this way, it kind of pushes up those fingers. It's unsupported grain cut. And that started to make sense and started to click. The big important takeaway from this is, for instance, when you go across the fingers like this, if you're going to cut across these, this finger is shorter than that finger. This longer grain underneath this shorter grain is supporting it and making the cut smooth. So that's what was my big aha, or my aha moment, that I started really understanding what was going on. The other one that's a great analogy is if you have a broom, same concept. You take a knife and you cut across the fibers of the broom, you're going to cut them away cleanly. However, if you go from the front of the broom into the fibers, they're just going to get all frayed. You can also think of a pig. You think, if you ever had a chance to touch a long-haired pig that's got bristly hair, the hair only lays down one way. If you go the opposite way, it goes back up. That was all kind of getting close, but it still wasn't 100% there. I'm going to demonstrate a supported cut and a unsupported cut using celery. First of all, I need to get some of this out of the way. You guys didn't know this is a cooking show too, did you? Okay, so if this is the curve of a bowl and we were to look at it through a microscope, it's going to look a lot like this. If you've got an outside curve of a bowl, you're going to have end fibers. They're not going to be cut so square like this, but you get the general idea. Those fibers are sticking out of one another. Now, if we try to make a cut across this, where the length of the grains underneath are shorter than the grain I'm cutting on, this is an unsupported cut. This is not what you want to do, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to see an example of why. Okay, see this tearing? That's kind of reminiscent of what's going to happen with an unsupported cut. It's not as clean as it could be. Now, if we take the same configuration of the side of a bowl, using the celery as an example, and we make a supported cut, we have the grain, the length of the grain underneath the grain that's being cut is longer, and that's the case here. So this top grain is going to be cut, this one's longer, the next one underneath is longer. That grain, these grains that are underneath the top one are supporting it. Now if I make the same cut, look how clean and precise that was. You can see how even everything just laid down because those underlying layers supported the cut. That is a grain supported cut. I'm going to have some celery. I should bring snacks out in the shop more often. Okay, so hopefully you're starting to get the point of the supported cut, the supported grain cut, and how important it is to explain it and understand it versus just saying downhill or with the grain. Here's a cutaway of a bowl. And if you can imagine, you can see the lines. This is the grain moving through this bowl. Now, if I'm on the exterior of this bowl and I'm cutting, and I decide to go from the rim to the base of the bowl, you can see where there's going to be problems, especially right in here, where you're going to have these longer grains that have nothing underneath them to support them, and they're going to start splintering off and leaving a lot of broken in grain along the edge of your bowl. Likewise, you can see the same thing here. And if you were to go from the inside of the bowl up, you can see how it's going to dig into these fibers here. Luckily, that's not so easy to do with a bowl when you turn a bowl, and that's part of the reason why we do side grain bowls more than in grain bowls, is that you basically are cutting from the rim down to the inside, and that is a supported cut going from the rim to the base. On the exterior, starting from the base going up to the rim is a supported cut. Now, I mentioned earlier, you can also do in grain bowls. This would be the equivalent of basically putting a log on the lathe. A lot of people think of bowls, when they first hear of turning of bowls, they imagine that that's how it's done. You just take a log and stick it on the end of the lathe, and you put the tailstock in and spin it into a bowl. Well, you can do that. There's some disadvantages to that. One of those, if you do that, the end grain is going to be running up and down. One of the disadvantages is turning the interior. Now the exterior on an in-grain bowl, now again, this is not the most common bowl, and I don't turn these very often. I do turn them, but not that often. But on an in-grain bowl, you would want to start on the exterior from the rim and work down to the base. And you can see why. If you're started from the base and worked up, I'm going to dig in underneath these fibers and pop them out and break those grains. The trick with an in-grain bowl is you have to turn it and cut it from the inside up to the rim, and that can be challenging, especially if it's a narrower bolt length. But essentially you can see how that's all supported, the grain cuts are all supported going up here. If you go down into an in-grain bowl, you're going to go right down into those fibers and split them and crack them and cause all kinds of issues going down there. All right, those were all supported cuts, and as you can see on the end grain here, how smooth that turned out. As a matter of fact, when I was doing the end cut here, perpendicular, it really didn't cut that smooth. However, having those underlying longer grains underneath the layer that I was cutting, supporting them, this grain-supported cut let the bowl gouge make a beautiful finished cut. Now, another way that I learned how to make a proper supported grain cut was by doing it incorrectly. So if I go from the rim towards the base, that is an unsupported grain cut. So the fibers I were cutting were longer than the underlying fibers, and look how horrible that turned out. That's the same in grain right there. That's it. That is going against the grain. Now you can see that really clearly. This is a very dry piece of pine that I'm using because I know this is going to demonstrate really well. And it's going to show you how dramatic an unsupported cut can look. So if you're turning bowls and you're getting a finish that looks like this and you're thinking, wow, something's not right. It could be that you have the bull gouge cutting in the wrong direction and making an unsupported cut. Now let me make a supported cut to clean that up. Look how nice that turned out. Now, what you're seeing right there are the bottoms of the torn out areas from that unsupported cut I just made earlier. What happens is when you tear out those ingrain fibers, they go down below the surface quite a ways, and you have to cut away several layers of material before they're smoothed out again. So let me make another pass with a supported cut. Now you can see they're starting to get better. Still a little bit rough, but you'll be surprised that when you make an unsupported cut, or if you get a catch or you have tear out, that tear out can go very deep down in between those grains, and you may have to remove as much as an eighth to a quarter of an inch of material before you get back down to fibers that haven't been torn out and have a smooth finish again. That's something to keep in mind as well. All right, here's the trick question. Let's see if you're getting this. If you wanted to make a closed form bowl, and that's basically any bowl that has a opening that is narrower than the widest part of the bowl. In this case, this is just a very subtle closed rimmed bowl. And what would you use? What direction would you cut? And again, this is a side grained bowl blank. Would you cut from the base up to the top? Or would you start at the top and go to the base? That's the question. The biggest thing you need to remember is there needs to be a longer grain underneath the grain that you're currently cutting. That's the biggest takeaway, and that makes it a supported grain cut. This primarily pertains to the ingrain fibers. Those ingrains are what are sticking out, and how we're cutting them with the bull gouge as they come around is what's critical. If we don't do it right, they're going to tear out. And as you saw, that tear out can be very dramatic, and it's going to force us to have to fuss with that surface. And it's not something that stands out very easily because it could be a quarter inch deep. You would have to sand the entire bowl down a quarter of an inch, which could take forever. So you want to learn to make these cuts really smooth and clean with a nice supported grain cut. So the biggest takeaway is make sure those longer grains are underneath your shorter the grains being cut. However, these have something to do with the trick question here. So if you think about the length of these fibers, if this was the side of a bowl and you had shorter fibers, shorter than shortest, how would you make that cut? That's kind of the same question we're talking about with a closed form bowl. How would you make that cut? All right, if you recall, I said it was a trick question, and it is a trick question because what you want to do is you want to keep in mind those supported grain fibers. You want longer grains underneath the shorter grains. You can see that this area is shorter than this area. So you're going to make the first cut from the base up to the highest point or the apex of the exterior of the bowl. Then you're going to make your second cut from the rim up to that apex. So there's two cuts. To have grain supported cut, you're going to basically come up to this high point right here from the bottom up and from the rim up. So that's a trick question. But as you can see, those are all supported grain cuts as you make that progression up to the highest point of the bowl. Okay, I realize a lot of you guys already understand this, but if you can think back to when you were first learning this, this can be very confusing. So I really wanted to go over this information and make it clear for people to understand a little bit better. Hopefully this video takes care of that. If you do understand the concept of supported grain cuts, then leave me a comment below and tell me what your aha moment was. What was it that triggered you to finally understand and get it? And for those of you that are still struggling with this, don't be discouraged. Just keep practicing. If you can't figure it out, then try a cut in both directions, and you're going to see which one's smoother. That's going to be your answer. So then take that as your definite answer and start placing together the visuals that go along with that to start putting together an idea of which direction you want to be. And again, disregard the cut with the grain and the downhill statements because those are completely useless as far as I'm concerned. I want to be able to help you guys learn how to turn wood bowls, and this is a critical step in turning wood bowls and getting it. And don't worry, once you do understand the supported grain cut, it kind of becomes natural, and you know just by your approach to the lathe what your cut's going to be, and you know that it's going to be supported. So don't think this is super overwhelming. You're gonna figure it out, and once you do, it's not a big deal. But it is important if you're struggling and you're trying to get a good finish on your bowls and you're getting tear out and things of that nature. There's a chance you might be making unsupported cuts. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please click the like button and subscribe if you're not already, and click that bell. You click the bell, you're going to be notified when my videos come out, and I've got tons more to share with you guys. And also, leave me a comment. If you do understand supported grain cuts, leave me a comment. Let me know what your aha moment was. How did you figure it out, and what was the moment that you decided how to cut properly with bull gouge? All right, guys. Well, thank you, and until next time, happy turning.